The smell of honey and burning wax had always belonged to Nora. Not the golden honey served at noble tables, thick and fragrant with wildflowers gathered by careful hands. Not that kind. The honey Nora knew was the forgotten kind, the kind that dripped slowly from abandoned hives tucked into the corners of Vithera village, between rotting fences and moss-covered stone walls, in the places where no one bothered to look anymore. She was 23 years old, and the entire village knew her. Not exactly by name. They knew her by what she was, the Omega without a pack. In Vithara, a village settled along the western borders of the kingdom of Dravenhold, unbonded Omegas existed in a kind of quiet limbo. They were not hunted. They were not cast out. They were simply overlooked, like old furniture no one throws away but no one uses either. Nora had learned to occupy that invisible space with a quiet grace that few recognized as strength. She had pale blonde hair, always braided over one shoulder, and eyes the color of winter sky, light, clear, and steady in a way that made people uncomfortable when she held their gaze too long. She wore a linen tunic the color of raw wool and a gray cloak that had seen better seasons, its hem frayed from years of walking the forest paths alone. She was not the kind of woman who turned heads in a crowded hall. She was the kind of woman you noticed only after she had already left the room, and then couldn't quite stop thinking about. But that morning, the village was not quiet. The Great Pack recognition ceremony happened once every 5 years in Vithara, and it was the single most important social event in any wolf's life. It was the night when alpha males formally declared their chosen mates before the assembled pack elders, when bonds were acknowledged, when the hierarchy of the village solidified itself like iron cooling in a blacksmith's mold. Torches lined the village square, banners in deep crimson and gold, the colors of the Vithera pack, hung from every post and beam. The smell of roasted meat and pine resin filled the cold evening air, mingling with wood smoke and the faint, sharp scent of nervous wolves. Nora stood at the edge of the square in her gray cloak, her braid resting over her left shoulder, and she was trying very hard not to hope. She had told herself not to hope. She had repeated it every morning for the past month, while she worked her hives at the edge of the village, while she carried her small clay jars of honey to the market stall that barely earned her enough to pay for firewood. She had said it to herself the night before, when her closest friend Marin had helped her press the wrinkles from her best tunic with a warm stone. Do not hope, Nora. He has never once promised you anything in words. But Doran had promised her in other ways. In glances held a breath too long across the market square, in the way he had appeared at her fence 3 weeks past with a bundle of dried herbs. For the bees, he'd said, though she hadn't asked. In the way he had stood beside her at the river festival last autumn, and said quietly that he thought unbonded Omegas were undervalued by Vithara's elders. She had believed him. That was the part she could not forgive herself for yet. You look fine, Marin said, appearing at her elbow with the efficiency of someone who had been watching Nora's face and already knew what it was doing. Marin was a beta, broad-shouldered and warm, with dark braids pinned at the back of her head and an expression of fierce loyalty that she wore as naturally as other women wore their cloaks. She had been Nora's companion since childhood, the one person in Vithara who had never once treated her as furniture. I look exactly like what I am, Nora said. And what is that? An Omega with no pack standing at the edge of a ceremony that was not designed for her. Marin clicked her tongue. You were invited. Doran's mother invited me, which is different from being wanted here. Marin said nothing to that, because Marin was honest, and they both knew it was true. Doran's mother, Sarah, was a gentlewoman who felt guilt easily, and expressed it through small kindnesses. Invitations, bowls of stew left at Nora's door, the occasional kind word at the well. She was not cruel, but she was also not the one who would be standing in the center of that square tonight to make a declaration before the pack elders. That would be Doran. He was a mid-rank alpha in the Vithara pack, broad across the shoulders, with reddish-brown hair and the easy confidence of a man who had never been told he was inadequate. He was not unkind, Nora thought. He was simply weak in the way that men who care too much about other people's opinions are always weak, quietly, invisibly, until the moment when it mattered most. The ceremony began as the last light left the sky. The pack elder, an ancient beta named Oswin, with a white beard that reached his chest, struck his staff against the stone platform at the center of the square 3 times. The crowd settled. Torches crackled. Nora's fingers tightened around the small object she held in her cloak pocket, a carved wooden bee, no larger than her thumb, that she had made herself last winter during the long, quiet nights when she had nothing else to do but work with her hands and think about what she wanted her life to look like. She had brought it tonight without quite knowing why. A talisman, perhaps. A reminder of who she was outside of this square, outside of this ceremony, outside of everyone else's assessment of her worth. One by one, the alpha males of Vithara stepped forward to make their declarations. Names were called. Women stepped forward to be acknowledged. The crowd responded with the low, resonant hum of pack approval, a sound that vibrated in the chest, ancient and instinctive. Nora felt it in her ribs each time it rose, a sound she had never been included in. Then Oswin called Doran's name. Doran stepped onto the stone platform. He was dressed finely, a dark tunic with silver thread at the collar, his boots polished, his hair combed back. He looked like what he was, a man preparing to make the most important declaration of his social life. He looked confident. He looked rehearsed. He did not look at Nora. She noticed that immediately. In the crowd that filled the square, she was standing close enough to the platform that he should have seen her without effort. But his gaze swept the square in a careful, deliberate arc that somehow managed to skip exactly the place where she was standing. Her heart did something quiet and terrible in her chest. Do not hope. I stand before the elders of Vithara, Doran said, his voice carrying easily across the square, to declare my chosen bond. The crowd stilled completely. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. I declare my bond to Lissa of the Hartwell line. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nora heard it, felt the ripples move outward through her body, and stood very, very still. Lissa of the Hartwell line was the daughter of Vithara's wealthiest merchant family, well-connected, well-regarded, an alpha female of appropriate standing. She was everything Vithara's pack hierarchy said Doran should want. She was not Nora. The pack hummed its approval. Lissa stepped forward from the crowd in a pale green gown, her expression carefully arranged into something between surprise and satisfaction. Doran took her hand. The elders nodded. The ceremony continued. Nora became aware that her hand, still in her cloak pocket, was pressing the carved wooden bee so hard against her palm that the small carved wings had left marks in her skin. She breathed in once through her nose, then out through her mouth. She would not cry here. She would not make a sound. She would not give this square, these people, this ceremony the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was an Omega without a pack, which meant she had spent her entire life finding her footing on ground that no one had smoothed for her, and she knew how to keep standing when the world knocked sideways. She turned quietly and began to walk toward the edge of the square, toward the dark street that would take her back to her cottage and her hives and the life she had built with her own 2 hands. She had almost reached the gap between the last 2 torches when she heard it. A different kind of stillness fell over the crowd behind her. Not the stillness of ceremony, something else. Something that prickled along the back of her neck and made the wolf instinct she rarely listened to go suddenly, sharply alert. She turned. 3 men had entered the square from the northern gate. They wore no Vithara colors. Their cloaks were black, edged in deep charcoal fur, and the way they moved through the crowd was not the way of men who were accustomed to asking permission to enter a space. The crowd parted for them without quite seeming to decide to do so, People simply moved instinctively, the way water moves around stone. The first man was broad and restless-looking, scanning the square with sharp dark eyes and a half-smile that suggested he found everything faintly entertaining. The second was leaner, with the kind of easy posture that meant he'd never once been in a room where he wasn't the most comfortable person present. The third, the one in the center, the one who had not yet looked at anything in particular, wore his black hair in long braids that fell past his shoulders, and he had eyes the color of deep water in winter, and he was looking, with the calm and absolute attention of a man who had already found what he came for, directly at Nora. She felt the weight of that gaze, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, quiet and complete. The way a man looks at something he has been searching for long enough that finding it no longer surprises him. Behind her, the ceremony continued. Doran was still holding Lys's hand. The elders were still nodding. Nora stood between the torchlight and the dark, the carved bee in her palm, and could not have said why she suddenly felt, for the first time in years, as though she had been seen. The three men did not belong to Vethara. Nora understood this the way wolves understand things, not through thought, but through the deeper, older language of scent and instinct. Their presence carried weight that had nothing to do with Vethara's pack hierarchy, nothing to do with merchants or elders or the careful social architecture of a border village. These men came from somewhere larger, somewhere with teeth. The one with the braids had not moved. He stood at the edge of the square with the stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard, and he was still watching her with those winter water eyes that gave nothing away and somehow took everything in. Nora made a decision. She turned away from him and walked. Not running, she would not run. But she moved with purpose through the narrow street that curved away from the square toward the eastern edge of the village, where the stone cottages grew smaller and the gardens wilder, and the smell of wood smoke gave way to something older. Earth, cold grass, and the faint sweetness of wax that clung to everything she owned. She heard footsteps behind her. One set, unhurried, exactly matching her pace. She did not stop. Her cottage sat at the end of a short lane, bordered by a low stone wall, and beyond that wall, arranged in a careful row along the southern face of the garden where the afternoon light fell longest, were her hives. 7 of them now. She had begun with 3 old wicker skeps that the village beekeeper, a man named Aldrich, had abandoned when his hands grew too stiff with age to manage them. Everyone had told her they were empty. Everyone had told her the colonies had died out 2 winters past, and the hives were worth nothing but kindling. Nora had taken them anyway. She pushed open her garden gate and heard it. The footsteps behind her stopped. She turned. The man with the braids stood at the edge of her lane, one hand resting on the top of her stone wall, and he was looking at her hives the way she had not expected anyone to look at them, with genuine attention. Not curiosity exactly, something quieter than curiosity. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone encountering a thing and understanding immediately that it matters. "You built these," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not perform itself. It simply existed, like the sound a large river makes, constant, unhurried, entirely sure of its own direction. "I restored them," Nora said. She kept her hand on the gate. "They belonged to an old beekeeper who had no use for them anymore." "And before you restored them?" "They were rotting in a corner behind the tanner's shed." She paused. "Everyone said the colonies were dead." "Were they?" "2 of them were." She looked at the row of hives, pale shapes in the torchlight that spilled faintly from the distant square. "One wasn't. One colony had survived the winter on its own in a cracked skep, with half its comb collapsed. It was smaller than it should have been, and half the village thought it was worthless." She stopped herself, She had not intended to say that much. "Why are you at my gate?" He looked back at her. In the low light, his eyes were darker than they had seemed in the square, but no less focused. He had a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, and he wore his authority the way some men wear old leather, so naturally that it no longer looked like something put on. "My name is Valen," he said. The name moved through her like cold water, finding cracks in stone. She knew that name. Every wolf in the western reaches of Dravenhold knew that name. Valen, AlphaKing of Dravenhold, Lord of the Seven Pack Territories, the man whose word was the closest thing this kingdom had to absolute law. The man whose seal on a document could end a border dispute that had run for 30 years. The man that Pack Alphas across the realm spoke of in the careful, measured tones reserved for things that could genuinely hurt you. He was standing at her garden gate. Nora kept her face very still. "I know who you are." "Then you understand why I don't usually explain myself at cottage gates." "And yet here you are." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile. More the suggestion that a smile existed somewhere in him and occasionally considered making an appearance. "And yet here I am." He looked at the hives again. "Your honey was served at the last regional council meeting in Vithara's great hall." "I noticed it." She blinked. "I sell my honey to the market. I don't choose where it goes after that." It was different from every other honey on the table. The color was darker. The taste had depth, clover and something else, something from the forest edge. He paused. "I asked where it came from. 3 different people told me it came from a woman at the edge of the village who kept bees that everyone else had given up on." Nora said nothing. She was aware that her heart was doing something unsteady, and she was choosing not to acknowledge it. "The ceremony tonight," Valen said. "The man who did not choose you." "That is not your concern," she said immediately, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she was grateful for. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He did not apologize for mentioning it either, which she found she respected more than she wanted to. "But I watched you walk out of that square, and I noticed something. I imagine you notice many things. You were not crying," he said. "You were not angry. You were carrying something in your hand and you were walking like a woman who already knew where she was going." The carved bee was still in her pocket. She did not reach for it. "I always know where I'm going," she said. "I live here." This time the almost smile came slightly closer to being a real one. "I meant something else." Before she could respond, the gate at the far end of the lane opened, and the other 2 men appeared, the restless, broad-shouldered one and the lean, easy-postured one, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had been sent to find their companion, and were unsurprised to find him standing at a stranger's garden wall in the dark. "Found you," said the broad one cheerfully. He had a scar above his right eyebrow, and the look of a man who had collected it in circumstances he probably found amusing. "We thought you'd gone to inspect the village granary." "Gavin," Valen said, with the tone of a man addressing a large, enthusiastic dog. "I'm just saying. You disappear from a ceremony and we find you at a beehive. There are many explanations for this, and granary inspection was one of them." Gavin looked at Nora with frank, uncomplicated interest. "Hello. Are you the beekeeper?" "I am," Nora said. "Valen's been talking about your honey for 2 months, Gavin said. He made the head cook source it for 3 separate. Gavin. Meals, Gavin finished, entirely unrepentant. The lean man, who had been leaning against the lane wall with his arms folded and the expression of someone watching a moderately interesting play, tilted his head at Nora. "Kale," he said, by way of introduction. "I apologize for him. We've tried returning him to the forest, but he always finds his way back." Despite everything, the ceremony, the hollow ache that still sat behind her ribs, The entirely impossible situation of standing in her own lane at night being regarded by the Alpha King and 2 of his men. Nora felt the corner of her mouth move. She pressed it back down. "You're all very far from Dravenhold's seat," she said. "Inspection of the Western Territories," Valen said. "We arrived this afternoon." He looked at her steadily. "I had intended to find the beekeeper in the morning. The ceremony complicated the schedule. I didn't ask you to follow me." "No," he said. "You didn't." A pause. "I'd like to see the hives properly, in daylight." He said it the way he seemed to say most things, not as a request designed to charm, not as a command designed to intimidate. Simply as a statement of intent, offered to her as information, the decision about what to do with it left entirely in her hands. Nora looked at him for a long moment. The torchlight from the distant square caught the silver fittings on his leather armor, the dark fur at his shoulders, the old scar along his jaw. He did not fill the silence with more words, which told her something important about him. "The bees are active from mid-morning," she said finally. "If you come before then, you'll disturb them." "Mid-morning," he said. "And I have conditions." His eyes sharpened slightly. "What conditions?" "You come with no more than 1 other person. The hives don't respond well to crowds, and neither do I." She met his gaze. "And whatever you think you know about me from watching me walk out of a village ceremony, you don't know anything yet." The silence that followed was complete. Then Valen said quietly, "Agreed." Gavin made a small sound behind him that might have been suppressed laughter. Cale said nothing, but something in his posture suggested he had just found the play considerably more interesting. Nora opened her gate, stepped through it, and latched it behind her without looking back. She walked to her cottage door, lifted the latch, and let herself inside. She set the carved wooden bee on the table beside her candle and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the ceremony still moving through the village square, the pack humming its approval for bonds she was not part of, a world that had spent years telling her she did not quite belong. She looked at the small carved bee on the table. 1 colony, she thought. Smaller than it should have been. Half its comb collapsed. Everyone said it was worthless. She lit her candle and went to bed. She did not sleep well. Not because of Doran. That pain had settled into something quieter overnight, like an ember that had burned through the wood beneath it and found only ash. It hurt less than she had expected, which perhaps said something about how much she had truly believed in him, or perhaps said something about how accustomed she had become to holding her own weight without help. What kept her awake was something else entirely. She lay on her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling beams, and thought about a man standing at her garden gate in the dark, looking at her hives, the way people rarely looked at anything she had built, as though the hives themselves were evidence of something worth understanding. She rose before dawn, as she always did. The morning routine grounded her. Water from the bucket by the door, cold enough to sharpen her thoughts. A heel of bread with a thin scrape of her own honey. Not the market jars, the private ones she kept for herself, darker and more complex than anything she sold, drawn from the oldest colony in the hive closest to the forest edge. She braided her hair by memory in the dark, fingers moving through the familiar motion without needing light. And by the time the first gray suggestion of dawn appeared in the east-facing window, she was already in the garden. The hives were quiet at this hour, the bees still clustered inside for warmth, the air holding that particular stillness that existed only in the last moments before the world decided to wake up. Nora moved along the row slowly, pressing her palm briefly against each hive in turn. A habit she had developed without consciously deciding to. A way of checking in that she would have been embarrassed to describe to anyone who might find it strange. The 4th hive hummed slightly warmer than the others. She made a note of it and moved on. She was checking the condition of the skep frames on the 6th hive when she heard the lane gate. She did not turn immediately. She finished what she was doing, carefully, without rushing, and then straightened and looked over her shoulder. Valen had come alone. He was dressed differently from the night before, still leather, still dark, but without the formal armor fittings, without the heavy fur at the shoulders. He looked like a man who had made a deliberate choice to arrive as something other than the AlphaKing of Dravenhold, which she suspected was not a choice he made often or easily. His braids were pulled back from his face and secured at the nape of his neck, and in the early morning light, the scar along his jaw was more visible than it had been by torchlight. He stopped at the garden gate and waited. She walked to it and opened it herself, which seemed to slightly surprise him, though his face did not do much with the surprise. "You're early," she said. "You said mid-morning. I wasn't certain of your definition. The bees define it, not me." She stepped aside to let him through. "When they begin to move freely at the entrance of the hive, that's mid-morning. They're just starting." She watched him enter the garden with the same attention she gave everything. Careful, unhurried. "You came alone. You asked for one companion at most. I came with none." He looked at the hives. "That seemed more respectful of your work." Nora said nothing to that. She turned and led him along the row. She had expected him to ask questions immediately. Most people who came to see the hives wanted to talk, wanted to fill the space with their own knowledge or their own assumptions, wanted to tell her things about bees that they had heard from someone else and half-remembered wrong. Instead, Valen walked beside her in silence, looking at each hive in turn with the focused attention of someone who understood that observation came before speech. She found herself recalibrating. "This is the oldest," she said, stopping at the 7th hive, the one at the end of the row, closest to the low stone wall that bordered the forest edge. It was also the largest, rebuilt twice from the original cracked skep, its current form a combination of wicker and timber that she had reinforced herself over 2 winters. "This is the one that survived." "The one everyone said was worthless," Valen said. "Yes." She looked at it. "When I found it, the colony had contracted so far into the center of the comb that most beekeepers would have called it dead. But the queen was still alive. The workers around her were still alive. They had pulled inward to protect what mattered most and let everything else go." She paused. "I've always thought that was a reasonable strategy." She felt him look at her, though she kept her eyes on the hive. "You didn't just restore them," he said. "You expanded them." 7 hives from 3. Yes. She moved to the nearest hive and carefully lifted the outer covering to show him the frame beneath. The deep amber comb, the careful geometry of cells, the slow morning movement of workers beginning to stir. People in Vethara said I was wasting my time, that the location was wrong, that the varieties of flower on this edge of the village weren't sufficient, that an unbonded Omega had no business managing anything that required patience and long-term investment. She replaced the covering gently. They said that for about 2 years. And then the honey started selling. She looked at him directly. Better than anyone else's in the market, consistently, every season. She kept her voice even. People stopped saying I was wasting my time. They started asking how I'd done it. A few of them asked if I would teach them. She paused. I noticed that no one apologized. Valen was quiet for a moment. Did you want them to? She considered this honestly. I wanted them to understand what they'd dismissed. Whether that comes with an apology or not is less important to me than the understanding. She moved to the next hive. Come and look at this one. The brood pattern here is the strongest of the 7. They spent the better part of an hour moving through the hives. Nora talked about the bees the way she always talked about them. Practically, specifically, with the kind of knowledge that came from years of daily attention rather than books. She told him about the winter she had lost a colony to cold and had nearly given up on the whole endeavor. She told him about the queen she had successfully relocated from a dying hive into a stronger one, a procedure that most experienced beekeepers said couldn't be done without losing both colonies. She told him about the particular clover that grew along the forest edge in late spring, the one that gave her darkest honey its unusual depth. He listened, not politely, genuinely. He asked questions that indicated he had been paying attention to the previous answers, which was rarer than it should have been. At some point she noticed they had sat down on the low stone wall at the end of the garden, both of them facing the hive row, the morning light now fully established and warm across the garden. She could not have said exactly when they had sat down or who had done so first. "There's something I should tell you," Valen said. She looked at him. "I've been through these western territories 3 times in the past 4 years. Vithara was on the route each time." He looked at the hives. "I saw you working here the second time, a 1.5 years ago. You were repairing the frame on that one." He indicated the 4th hive, the one that ran warm. "And you were doing it in the rain because there was a crack that needed sealing before the colony lost more heat." He paused. "You didn't stop working when my company rode past on the road," Nora thought back. She had a vague memory of a company of riders on the road above her cottage. She had registered them as wolves of rank by their scent and their horses and the quality of their cloaks. And she had kept working because the crack in the frame had needed sealing, and the rain was getting heavier. "I didn't know it was you," she said. "I know." Something in his voice shifted, just slightly, like a key turning. "That was partly why I noticed." She looked at him steadily. "You noticed me because I didn't look up." "I noticed you," he said carefully, "because you were repairing something that everyone else in that village had given up on, in the rain, alone, with the kind of attention that people usually reserve for things they love." He met her eyes. "And then I asked about you, discreetly. And what I learned was that the village largely considered you invisible." The morning air moved between them. Somewhere in the hive row, the bees were properly awake now, a low, sustained hum that Nora felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. "And last night," she said, "at the ceremony." "I had not planned to attend it," he said. "My company arrived in Vithara this afternoon, as I told you. The ceremony was underway." He paused. "I watched what happened." Nora kept her eyes on the hives. "Then you saw a perfectly ordinary thing. An Omega without a pack was passed over for a more suitable match. It happens in every village in Dravenhold." "It happens," Valen said quietly, "far too often." A pause. "And the man who did it is a fool." She did not answer immediately. She let the words sit in the morning air and felt them land somewhere real inside her, neither dismissed nor clung to. "He's not a fool," she said at last. "He's just not brave enough to choose something his pack hasn't pre-approved." She looked at the 7th hive, the oldest one, the survivor. "Most people aren't." Valen said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'd like to purchase your full harvest this season, all 7 hives, for the king's table and the council hall at Dravenhold." Nora turned to look at him fully. His expression was composed, direct, utterly serious. "That's a considerable quantity of honey," she said. "I'm aware. And a considerable distance to transport it. I have people who handle that." She studied him. "This isn't charity." "No," he said. "It's commerce. Your product is the best I've encountered in the Western Territories. I want it." He held her gaze. "But it is also," he added, with the precision of a man who had decided to be honest, even when it cost him something, "the beginning of what I hope will be a longer conversation." The hives hummed in the morning light. Nora looked at the row she had built from 3 abandoned skeps and years of quiet, stubborn work, and then she looked at the AlphaKing sitting on her stone wall with his braids loose from their binding, and his eyes the color of deep winter water. And she thought about colonies that survived by pulling inward around the things that mattered, letting everything else go. "Mid-morning tomorrow," she said. "I'll have the inventory ready." Something settled in his expression, not triumph, not relief. Something quieter, something that looked like a man who had made a promise to himself, silently, a long time ago, and was only now beginning to keep it. The inventory took Nora most of the following morning to prepare. She worked methodically, as she always did, cataloging each hive's yield by season, noting the variation in color and density between colonies, recording the approximate quantity of comb honey versus extracted, the jars already sealed and stored in her cold cellar, versus the harvest still pending from the hives that had not yet reached their peak. She wrote it all in a small bound ledger she kept on the shelf above her work table, the pages already dense with 2 years of careful notation in her small, precise handwriting. Maren arrived before she had finished, letting herself through the garden gate with the familiarity of someone who had been doing so since childhood. She stood in the cottage doorway, looked at Nora bent over the ledger, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I heard the AlphaKing was in your garden yesterday morning." Nora did not look up. News moves quickly in Vithera. News involving the AlphaKing and an unbonded Omega moves at approximately the speed of wildfire. Maren came inside and sat down across the table. Gavin, the broad one with the scar, apparently told 3 people in the tavern last night that Valen spent the morning looking at beehives and came back to the inn in a better mood than he'd been in for months. She folded her arms. "He seems like a man who talks freely." "He does," Nora agreed. "Valen is the opposite." Maren was quiet for a moment, studying Nora's face with the attention of someone who had known that face long enough to read the things it didn't say out loud. "Are you all right? After the ceremony, I mean. After Doran." Nora set down her quill. She looked at the ledger, at the careful columns of numbers that represented years of solitary work. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said honestly, "which is either a sign that I'm stronger than I thought, or that I cared less than I believed." She paused. "I'm not certain which." "Perhaps both," Maren said. "Perhaps neither cancels the other out." Nora looked at her. Then she picked up her quill again. "The AlphaKing wants to purchase the full harvest from all 7 hives." Maren blinked. "All 7. Lund, for the King's Table and the Council Hall at Dravenhold." A silence followed, in which Maren visibly processed this information, and then visibly decided to process only part of it at a time. "That would be, Nora, that would be more coin than you've made in 2 full years combined." "I know. And he sat in your garden and asked for it." "He sat on my stone wall," Nora said. "And yes." Maren was quiet again. Then, carefully, "Is the honey the only thing he's interested in?" Nora did not answer immediately. She thought about winter water eyes that held their focus without effort. She thought about a man who had watched her work in the rain a 1.5 years ago and had quietly asked after her and had not mentioned it until he had a reason to. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." Valen arrived at mid-morning with Kale rather than Gavin, which Nora noted as a deliberate choice. Kale, she had understood in their brief meeting, was the kind of man who observed without inserting himself, which made him easier company in a space that required attention. She brought out the ledger and laid it on the stone wall between herself and Valen, open to the inventory pages. He read it the way he seemed to do everything, thoroughly, without commentary, giving each page the time it warranted before moving to the next. Kale drifted toward the hive row and stood at a respectful distance, watching the morning flight of workers moving in and out of the entrance boards with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Your record-keeping is precise," Valen said. "I can't improve what I don't measure," Nora said. Every variation in yield taught me something. When I started, I lost one colony and didn't know why. By the third year, I could read the signs 3 weeks in advance. What signs? Brood pattern changes, worker behavior at the entrance, weight distribution in the comb. She leaned slightly over the ledger to indicate a notation from 2 winters past. That year, I caught a failing queen early enough to requeen before the colony collapsed. It saved the hive. He looked at the notation, then at her. You taught yourself all of this. There was no one to teach me. Aldrich was already too ill to explain much before he passed. She closed the ledger. Books helped. The village has a small library the elders maintain. I read everything they had on apiculture, and then I learned the rest by paying attention. Something moved in his expression, brief, deep, and quickly contained. The elders' library, he said. 3 books total on the subject. 2 of them contradicted each other. She allowed herself a small dry note. It was instructive. Kale spoke from the hive row without turning. There are 14 volumes on apiculture in the Dravenhold Royal Library, he said conversationally, most of them untouched for decades. Nora looked at him. He turned with an expression of complete innocence. I'm simply noting it. Valen gave him a look that contained multitudes. Kale returned to observing the bees. They agreed on terms for the harvest purchase before the morning was out. Fair terms, Nora noted, not terms designed to favor the buyer at the expense of the seller. She had half expected negotiation. There was none. Valen named a price. She recognized it as just, and they confirmed the arrangement with a handshake over the stone wall that felt more serious than she'd anticipated. His hand was large and warm, and held hers for exactly as long as the handshake warranted, and not a moment longer, which was somehow more affecting than it had any right to be. His company was due to depart Vithara the following morning. He did not say this as an apology. He said it as information, in the same direct way he said most things, and she respected him for not dressing it in sentiment it hadn't earned yet. What she had not expected was Doran. He appeared at the lane gate that afternoon, while Nora was sealing the last of the market jars alone in her garden. She heard the gate and looked up, and there he was. Redder in the face than usual, his posture carrying the specific tension of a man who had spent the previous night arguing with his own conscience and lost. Nora, he said. She looked at him for a long, even moment. Doran. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. I heard that the AlphaKing came here, to see you. He came to see the hives, she said, and then he purchased the harvest. Doran's jaw tightened. The whole harvest? All 7 hives, yes. She set down the jar she was holding and straightened. If you've come to say something, say it. I have work to finish before the light goes. He looked at the hive row, then back at her. His expression was complicated in the way that expressions become complicated when a person realizes something true about themselves that they find uncomfortable. I should have... He stopped again. Lissa's family has strong connections to the Eastern Pack Alliance. My father said... I understand, Nora said. Her voice was not angry. It was something quieter than anger, and she thought that quietness might be the most honest thing she could offer him. You made the choice that your pack approved of. I'm not going to tell you it was wrong, Doran, but I am going to tell you that it was yours. He looked at her like a man who wanted to be absolved of something, and had realized, standing at her gate, that she was not the person who could give him that. I'm sorry, he said. I know, she said, and she thought she meant it, not as a gift to him, but as the truth. She believed he was sorry. She simply also believed that sorry in this case was too small a word to do very much useful work. He left without saying anything more. Nora picked up her jar and went back to work. That evening, as she was banking her fire for the night, she heard a knock at her cottage door. 3 even strikes, unhurried. She opened it. Valen stood on her step, alone, without armor or fur cloak. Just leather and his braids and those steady eyes. He was holding something, a small flat package wrapped in dark cloth and tied with a cord. "My company leaves at first light," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me." "I brought something." He held out the package. She took it and unwrapped it. Inside was a book, old, its spine worn soft with handling, its cover stamped with the image of a hive, and the title set in faded gilt, "On the Governance of Bees and the Nature of Colonies." "It's from the Dravenhold Library," he said. "The 14th volume Cale mentioned. The one most recently consulted." A pause. "By me, approximately 2 days ago, when I realized I had no idea what I was looking at when I looked at your hives, and intended to correct that before I came back." Nora looked up from the book. "Before you came back," she said. He held her gaze without flinching. "I intend to return to the Western Territories in 6 weeks. The harvest transport will require my oversight." Another pause. And for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not entirely contained. Something that had weight and intention behind it. "That is not the only reason." The fire crackled behind her. The night air was cold and smelled of pine and the distant sweetness of the hives. She looked at the book in her hands, then at him. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he confirmed. She stepped back from the door. "You should come in. It's cold. I'll make tea." She paused. "It won't be a long visit. You have an early departure." He stepped inside without ceremony, ducking slightly under the low beam at the entrance, and she closed the door against the night. He sat in the chair by the fire that no one else ever sat in and looked entirely, quietly at ease, as though he had been sitting there for years. She put the book on the shelf above the work table, next to the ledger. They talked until the fire burned low, about bees, about governance, about what it meant to build something from what others discarded. He told her about a territory in the northern reaches of Dravenhold, where the pack had nearly collapsed from internal division, and how he had spent 3 years rebuilding it piece by careful piece. She told him about the winter she had nearly given up. He listened like a man who understood that some things only get said once, and that listening properly was the only appropriate response. When he left, he paused at the door and looked at her for a moment, the same look he had given her in the square, complete and unhurried and entirely honest. Then he walked out into the dark, and Nora stood in her doorway until she could no longer hear his footsteps on the lane. She turned back to her cottage. Her fire. Her hives beyond the window, quiet in the cold. 6 weeks, she thought. She went to bed, and this time she slept soundly. 6 weeks passed the way honest work always passes. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a fullness that left no room for emptiness. Nora read the book Valen had left her twice. She made notes in the margins in her small, precise handwriting, disagreeing with 2 chapters and finding confirmation for 3 things she had already suspected about her oldest colony. She expanded the 7th hive's frame structure based on a technique described in the 9th chapter, and watched the colony respond over the following weeks with the kind of quiet, steady growth that felt like being understood. Marin visited often. She did not ask about Valen constantly, which Nora appreciated, though her eyes asked the question every time she glanced at the book on the shelf. Doran she saw twice at the market. He nodded. She nodded. There was no cruelty in it, and no warmth either. Just the clean, honest distance of 2 people who had passed through the same moment and come out on different sides of it. Lissa was pleasant when they crossed paths, which Nora found made things considerably simpler. She tended her hives every morning. She sealed her jars. She kept her ledger. She waited without calling it waiting. On the 43rd day, she heard horses on the road above her cottage. She did not look up from the hive frame she was inspecting. She finished what she was doing, carefully, without rushing. and then straightened and turned, and Valen was at her garden gate. He had brought 4 riders this time, but they remained on the road. He came to the gate alone. He was dressed for travel, dusty from the road, his braids loosened slightly from the journey, and he was looking at her with the same steady attention he had given her hives on that first morning, as though what he saw confirmed something he had already known. She walked to the gate and opened it. "You're 3 days early," she said. The harvest transport arranged itself more efficiently than expected. A pause. That is not the only reason. She remembered him saying those words 6 weeks ago. She held his gaze. "Come and see the 7th hive," she said. "It's changed." He came through the gate and walked with her to the end of the row. The 7th hive, the survivor, the one everyone had discarded, stood broader and stronger than it had in spring, its new frame extension solid, the entrance board busy with workers moving in the unhurried, purposeful rhythm of a colony that had found its rhythm and kept it. Valen looked at it for a long moment. "You expanded it," he said. "Chapter 9, she said. "You were right about the book." Something in his expression shifted, that rare, quiet movement that she had learned to recognize as the closest he came to open feeling. He looked at her. "I have a proposal," he said. "Not a commercial one." Nora waited. "There is a territory in the eastern reach of Dravenhold," he said, "that has no royal apiarist. The castle there has land enough for 40 hives. The meadows are significant. Clover, wildflower, forest edge." He paused. "I have been looking for the right person to build it for 3 years." She looked at him steadily. "And you believe that person is me?" "I know it is," he said. "Without performance, without ornament. Simply as the truth, stated plainly, the way he stated everything that mattered." "That is a large thing to ask," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It would require leaving Vithara. It would require building something new in unfamiliar ground." His eyes stayed on hers. "I'm aware of what I'm asking. I'm also aware that you have done exactly that before, with 3 broken hives and no help, and built something that reached the king's table." A pause. "I am not asking you to be brave. You already are. I am asking if you are willing." Nora looked at her hives, all 7 of them, standing in the morning light, built from what everyone else had thrown away. She thought about a colony that had survived by pulling inward around what mattered most. She thought about the winter she had nearly given up, and the spring that had come anyway. She thought about Myron, who would tease her for this and then help her pack. She thought about a man who had watched her work in the rain and said nothing for 1.5 years because he was waiting until he had something real to offer. She thought about the carved wooden bee on her table. "I have conditions," she said. His mouth moved. This time it was unambiguously a smile, brief, real and warmer than she had expected from a face that held itself so carefully. "You always do. The 7 hives come with me. All of them." She met his gaze. "Including the 7th. "Agreed. Maren comes too if she chooses. She'll need a position in the territory household. She's capable of far more than Vithara has ever given her credit for." "Agreed. And I run the apiary myself. No oversight from castle stewards who know nothing about bees." "Agreed." He paused. "Is there anything else?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come to her gate in the dark and sat on her stone wall in the morning light and left her a book and come back 3 days early and was standing in her garden now with dust from the road on his cloak and the most serious eyes she had ever looked into. "Yes," she said. "One more thing." He waited. "The longer conversation you mentioned," she said. 6 weeks ago. I'd like to have it." The smile returned, steadier this time, certain of itself. "So would I," he said. I've been having it in my head since the second time I rode past your cottage and you didn't look up." She laughed, a real one, short and surprised. And the sound of it seemed to catch him off guard in the best way. The way a man looks when something he hoped for turns out to be true. She offered him her hand. He took it, and held it, this time, a breath longer than a handshake required. 3 months later, the 7 hives stood in a new row along the southern meadow wall of East Hollow Castle, the oldest colony in its place at the end, beside the forest edge where the clover grew thick and the wildflowers ran all the way to the tree line. The territory smelled of honey and pine and the particular richness of land that had been waiting for someone to tend it properly. Marin had taken charge of the castle's household stores with the efficiency of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and intended to make up for lost time. She visited the hives every morning, not because she kept bees, but because she liked to stand in the meadow and watch them work. Doran and Lissa remained in Vithera. He became Pack Elder's assistant the following year, a respectable position, safe and approved, exactly what his father had always wanted for him. He did not visit East Hollow. Nora did not expect him to. Valen kept his promise, the silent one, the kind made without words, and kept through every small, deliberate act that followed. He came to the meadow in the mornings when his council duties allowed it. He learned the difference between the colonies. He remembered which hive ran warm and asked after it by its position in the row. He read the ledger she kept, not to oversee her work, but because he wanted to understand it, and the difference mattered enormously to her. On the morning of the winter solstice, with frost on the hive roofs, and the meadow silver with cold, he came to the apiary as he always did. He stood beside her at the 7th hive, the survivor. And for a while they simply listened to the hum of it, steady and deep, a colony that had outlasted every prediction made about it. He took her hand. She held it. Above them, the winter sky was the same color as his eyes, clear and deep, and full of a light that asked nothing and offered everything. The bees hummed on. And Nora, who had once been invisible to every eye that hadn't known where to look, stood in the meadow she had built and felt, with the same quiet certainty she trusted in all things that were true, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.